Hello and welcome to Why Do We Do That? A psychology podcast that deconstructs human behavior from the perspectives of social scientists, psychologists, and others that use applied psychology in their work. I'm your host, Dr. Ryan Moyer. In this episode, I sat down with clinical psychologist and author Dr. Cortney Warren. Cortney specializes in eating pathology, addictions, self-deception, and cultural diversity. To date, she has written almost 50 peer-reviewed journal articles and delivered more than 75 professional presentations and public addresses. She is the author of several books and book chapters, including Lies We Tell Ourselves, The Psychology of Self-Deception, and Letting Go of Your Ex, CBT Skills to Heal the Pain of a Breakup and Overcome Love Addiction, which was the focus of our conversation. The main takeaway from my conversation with Cortney was the realization that romantic relationships, much like substances or compulsive behaviors, can become deeply addictive. When a relationship ends, especially unexpectedly, it can expose just how tightly our sense of well-being has been intertwined with another person. In the aftermath of a breakup, many of us experience something similar to withdrawal, intense cravings, intrusive thoughts, and emotional lows that can feel overwhelming if left unchecked. These reactions can pull us into dark, consuming patterns unless we intervene with intention. The path forward, then, is not to fixate on the intensity of the pain, but to shift our focus toward grieving the loss and learning how to move through it in a healthy, constructive way. I also appreciated Cortney's framing of a breakup as the beginning of a grieving process, rather than a problem to be solved. Our instinct is often to fight for the relationship, to restore what was lost at any cost. But there is a more grounded and ultimately more healing path. It involves honoring the relationship for what it was, allowing ourselves to fully experience the sadness of its ending, and accepting that even if it once felt irreplaceable, it is not the end of our capacity to love or be loved. New connections can and will emerge in time. Whether you recognize patterns of love addiction in yourself or are simply navigating the pain of a recent breakup, Cortney's insights offer a powerful framework for reframing the experience and moving toward a more hopeful and emotionally healthy future. Enjoy. Okay, today I am joined by Cortney Warren. Thank you so much for being on today.
Thank you for having me.
Cortney has a new book out called Letting Go of Your Ex, CBT Skills to Heal the Pain of a Breakup and Overcome Love Addiction. So we're going to be talking about the elements of a breakup, the feelings associated with breakups. We're going to be talking about how that can, in some individuals, spiral out of control and kind of take over their lives and how to move past that. Why don't we start by examining why you chose the term love addiction in the first place as part of your discussion in this book. How is it that love can be similar to other types of things that we traditionally associate with addiction?
That's such a great question because when most of us think of the word addiction, the first thing that pops into our mind is drugs and alcohol, which makes sense because historically, that's really the focus of any addictive treatment and any way that we talk about it from a psychological perspective. But the term love addiction was actually started way back in the 80s with a book that came out called Love and Addiction by Peel and Brodsky, where they really described couples who seemed like they were addicted to their mate. They were in a really dysfunctional relationship and they were coming in for couples therapy, but they wouldn't seem to distance themselves and be able to detach. And so the term has really grown in popularity, even though it's not a psychological diagnosis, because we have a large influx of research looking at addictive behaviors. So, what I mean by that is things like cell phone use, gambling, gaming, sex, pornography, anything that stimulates the pleasure center of the brain that in some people actually looks really addictive. And in that conversation, we actually find love and breakups. Not for everyone, but for some people, when they fall in love, it actually mimics a very addictive process in the brain that makes them compelled to think about their mate, to be around their mate, to talk to their mate, to plan for a future together in a way that feels hyper focused, like any
Hmm.
addiction would be.
Hmm.
So that's really where the term comes from.
Yeah. I like that the content in your book can clearly apply to as good advice to ordinary breakups in the same way that you can use the tools and techniques for more prolonged breakups that start to take over. Um, Before we actually talk about like what it looks like to suffer from love addiction, I feel like we should really establish what a typical breakup should look like because I get the sense that sometimes when breakups happen, we kind of we experience all these negative emotions, and sometimes I think we exacerbate these emotions by hyper focusing on like, is this normal? Like,
Hmm.
am I supposed to feel this way? I'm being so obsessive, and you might start to like distance yourself from your behavior and be like, is what I'm doing abnormal, right?
Yes.
So why don't you talk a little bit about what a typical breakup should feel like?
Well, for anyone listening who has dated, we all know that breakups are really not a whole lot of fun. Even if it's a breakup that you want, even if it's one that you initiated,
Hmm.
the quote unquote normal experience of a breakup is pretty unpleasant because it means that either you're not that into this person that you're dating, you might be afraid you're going to hurt their feelings, you might be madly in love with someone, but know that it really isn't healthy for you. You may be living with someone, it may be a long relationship. So there are all these relationship factors that will influence how hard a normal breakup is, quote unquote. But in general, it's pretty unpleasant. And I think there is a degree of difficulty that most of us are going to find when we break up with a romantic partner that we cared about or were dating for a meaningful amount of time. You are probably going to feel some sadness. You are probably going to have some lifestyle transition where you used to call them or you used to text them, or maybe you even lived together and now you don't. And so there's going to be this loss, this space that they used to occupy in your life, yet they're no longer there. Those are really common aspects of breakups that almost all humans will go through, no matter what, right? So it is a loss in some way. It is a transition. It is difficult. Oftentimes it means you're shifting friend groups, you're shifting lifestyles, you're shifting what you normally do over the course of a day. And a lot of that is a jolting experience for most of us.
Hmm.
When it really is a more problematic, what I would call exaholic breakup, is when, particularly after the breakup occurs, the person is so hyper focused and fixated on their ex that it seems like they're stuck in a non-relationship relationship. They're stuck in a relationship with their ex who they are no longer dating anymore, who is no longer their mate, yet their world still revolves around them in a way that makes it so difficult for them to actually enjoy their current life.
Hmm.
And that's when I would start to say we might want to do an assessment to look at whether this looks like an addictive process.
So it strikes me that there are a variety of things that might predispose someone to let's say suffering from these challenges. Like, there, we could talk about childhood, we could talk about their past relationship experience, right? All of these may contribute to how quickly someone moves on. I mean, not to be fair, some relationships, maybe it does take a long time to heal, and so there is some preoccupation and obsession that happens. But in your view, like, broad picture, what contributes to the likelihood that somebody might go down this problematic path in the first place?
Hmm. Well, the first thing I'd want to say is that I think we have a growing body of literature that documents that romantic love, falling in love, is biologically a drive that is meant to make you feel addicted to a mate.
Right.
So, what I mean by that is when you think about dating and you look out into the sea of potential options, your body is programmed in some ways to look around and find someone that you become interested in. They spark something in you. You're attracted to them and hyper focus on them so that you want to get to know them better. You want to spend time with them. You want to develop a life with them. You want to touch them. That process of experiencing lust for someone and then developing a relationship with them where you are head over heels, euphorically, madly in love, in and of itself puts you at risk for having an exaholic breakup. Because that euphoric feeling, that natural high that anyone who's ever fallen really madly in love knows, is incredibly compelling. And it's really the crux of any addictive behavior, that desire to use something because it feels so good and not using it feels bad. So I think in general, any of us could experience a really, really painful, rough breakup if we fall in love hard enough. And then for whatever reason, we break up. Either our mate doesn't feel that way about us, or there's some deal breaker that we can't negotiate, or we just know that it's bound not to work. It still can be crushing in a way that keeps us going back, keeps us churning, keeps us thinking about them and wanting to make it work even when we know that it can't. So that's one answer. I think any of us could actually have an exaholic breakup.
Yeah, and I like how, I mean, this is a common theme for a lot of maladaptive behaviors, maladaptive patterns of behavior, which is, it's just a slight detour from something that's supposed to happen. I mean, if you look at parents and their children, or mothers and their babies, they have to develop an obsessive relationship with this being, because that is what is supposed to happen. If you have a passing interest in your baby, it's going to drastically increase the likelihood that they may not survive, especially early human ancestors. And so love and these like core relationships, they do, right, that you are supposed to go through this like deep dive into a pool and get immersed, because that is what helps to keep that person around and helps keep you connected, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And evolutionarily, you're bringing this up as well, that it makes sense that we have to fall in love enough that we will have sex, make babies, and stay together long enough to ensure the survival of our offspring. At some level, it is a biological drive to become hyperfixated on your mate. And then, as you just said, with your child, if you end up having a child. And some people do talk about the addictive nature of love as a parent as well. It's different in some ways than a romantic partner, but there is this hyper focus, obsessionality, bonding, care, emotion that ideally comes with having a child that
Mhm.
is a survival-based drive.
So let's zoom in on the environment post breakup. So obviously, again, we're going to be kind of toggling back and forth between behaviors that help everyone versus behaviors that are kind of specific to the love addiction type
Hmm.
personality. But as I mentioned, I think most of this applies to everyone. Right after a breakup, this sensitive spot where the emotions peak and people are basically, if you are the receiving end of the breakup, you might feel like you're drowning and you're just trying to paddle and, you're going to try to potentially get that person back. You're going to be shocked. There's all kinds of emotions going on. But obviously the goal is to work towards moving on.
Yes.
Um, what is the biggest misstep or mistake that people make early on in a breakup that if changed could make the process go a lot smoother?
I have so much empathy for people in that acute stage right after a breakup, particularly if it's not a breakup that they wanted,
Mhm.
because I think it brings up so many self-esteem diminishing questions in their own mind about what this means about them as a human being. So I would have to say, in terms of mistakes that people make, which really aren't mistakes that they're choosing to make, it's really more of the nature of experiencing unrequited love in a really miserable breakup,
Mhm.
is this desire for answers. That somehow there is something that they could do to fix it, to get back together, to understand it, that somehow their mate could give them a reason why they're leaving that somehow would make them feel better. And the reality is that one of the first tools I want anyone to use when they're going through a really rough breakup like this is to sit in a space of radical acceptance that currently you are broken up. And you may never get a reason as to why you are broken up or why it's not going to work that ever feels adequate to you. And the more you allow yourself to be in a space of bargaining or denial where you are saying, well, I can change them, or they'll come back to me, or we can make this work, the more you're living in an alternate reality that isn't actually your current state of being. And what I really encourage people to do as early as possible is actually sit with the really rough truth that for today, you are broken up. And that might really hurt. And that might really not be what you want, but it is true. And I would much rather have you focus on dealing with the truth than living in an alternate reality where you're having a whole host of emotions and feelings and behaviors that are grappling with how you're going to get back together.
Yeah, it really speaks to more broadly how we deal with discomfort in general because as you note, we want answers, we want closure, and it's not, as you said, there is no answer, there's no sequence of words that is going to make the discomfort go away, which is why it's so important to, I was talking with this about this issue with my wife, and she likes to use the term let the dust settle, and that applies to whether it's an argument with your spouse or if it's a breakup. You have to let the dust settle, and I love that you talk so much about radical acceptance in the book.
Mm. It's such a challenge for all of us as humans, really, right? Especially when we're going through a loss. And for many people, breakups really look like grieving, especially if it was someone that you cared about. There are breakups where it's a relief. There are breakups where people are like, thank goodness, right? I didn't want to be in this relationship. But for many breakups, It does feel like a loss of a dream, a loss of a partner, a loss of a life that you thought you were building together. And really sitting with that loss and acknowledging that it's there, learning to work with your emotions, learning to work with your impulsive or compulsive desires to act out, to not feel the feelings, is really part of the journey of recovery.
Yeah. I'd like to think that if you walk somebody through the process and you told them, let me indulge you for a second. I know that you might think that you can get back together with them. Let's say that's a possibility. We still need to set it aside. We need to set it aside now. It's reality on reality's terms.
Mhm.
And so even if there is a scenario where this relationship, gets rekindled, let's push that out and let's wait 30 days and revisit it. And this the same thing happens with substances, right?
Mhm.
If you have addiction is all about your relationship with the substance, and the cravings cloud your judgment. When you take time off from that substance, you start to see and perceive things differently. And it strikes me that love and thinking about your past relationship operates similarly.
Absolutely. And you're again liking it to substance use. And just to be clear, really the characteristics of addiction. What do we mean when we talk about addictive behavior or an addiction to a substance? There are generally six criteria that we are looking for that would indicate that you potentially have an addictive relationship with a stimuli, whether it's alcohol or drugs or your lover or pornography or gambling, that slot machine. It starts with salience, with the fact that the addictive stimulus is the most important thing in your life. So when it comes to love and breakups, that means that your lover, who is now your ex, is still the most important thing in your life. Using the stimulus modifies your mood, which means being around your lover or your ex makes you feel good or keeps you from feeling bad. Drinking makes you feel better or keeps you from feeling worse. In addition, you'll experience cravings. So you want to use the substance more. You're thinking about your ex. You're wondering what they're doing. You're wanting to reconnect. You want those answers. You want to talk to them. You will experience withdrawal symptoms so that when you're not with them, you're pining after them. You're planning for your next time that you can potentially run into them. You will experience tolerance such that you want more and more and more of the drug or your ex over time. And it's associated with conflict in your life and relapse. So, all of this focus on the ex, the cravings, the desire to be around them, negatively influences your emotional health, oftentimes your physical health, and causes conflict at work, in your ability to function, in your relationships, with your health, in ways that are problematic for your ability to enjoy the present.
Mhm.
So that's really what we're talking about when we're thinking of what does addiction mean? What is an addictive stimulus? Whether it's alcohol or a slot machine, it's really those six characteristics.
Now, how long should someone expect to grieve an ended relationship? Obviously, there is no specific number. Um, you hear all these pop psychology numbers, and it takes 21 days to start a habit and stuff like that. 10,000 hours of practice, which are most. Anytime you hear a number, you have to be skeptical. Most of these are, habits don't take 21 days. Some habits take 3 days. Some take 30. It depends on the habit, of course. But you see all kinds of pop culture explanations, right? The half rule for
Mhm.
it's half the time. That's how long it takes to heal after a relationship. So if you've been in a 6 month relationship, expect to be symptomatic for 3 months, right? Um, Speculate a little bit. How long do you think it should take to grieve an important relationship?
I always stay away from shoulds because we're all so diverse and there are so many variables. It depends on so many things. You asked earlier about people who might be more or less vulnerable to a love addicted breakup. And I think there are a couple of things I should note about that might affect how long it takes to get over an ex. The first is that I think young adults and adolescents who are having their first major love affair, where they would say, "This was my first love," oftentimes struggle with that breakup more than even many others. So if you have a teenager or a young adult who says, "This was the love of my life, I thought we were going to be together forever," and then they break up, it often takes a longer time to move forward. There are many reasons for that. Biologically, there are hormone shifts in adolescence, there's a lack of life experience, there is a whole cultural internalization of what it means when you fall in love, that it's bound to work. And so I found this person and now we're going to be together forever. There's a lot of kind of realities of being the first time in love that make that breakup particularly hard. And I will say that even working with older clients, much older clients, they will still sometimes talk about their first love and how they still think about them and they
Mm.
still fantasize about them to some degree. I would also say that people who have experienced a large amount of early childhood trauma or adverse childhood experiences that made it very difficult for them to trust other people and themselves in intimate relationships often struggle with breakups more than others. And a lot of that has to do with core beliefs that they have developed over time about the nature of love and the ability to be intimate emotionally and trust other people. The idea here is that if you learned from early childhood on that people are not trustworthy or that something is wrong with you, it's going to be very difficult for you to bond with somebody as a romantic partner, particularly when you fall in love with them. So, in those groups, I would say it could take a very long time to unpack the relationship. And it isn't anything inherent necessarily about the ex. And that's something that I talk a lot about with clients, that it's very common for them to be focused on their ex as if they're this magical person, as if they were perfect, as if they're the only one for them, as if they're never going to find somebody else. When the reality is their ex is just a human being like the rest of us. There's nothing magical about them. And in fact, they have plenty of faults like all of us. And so some of unpacking and healing from the breakup is really learning to focus on ourselves, looking in the mirror and saying, what am I bringing to this relationship that really has nothing to do with my ex, that I have projected onto them or attributed to them because of who I am?
Mhm.
And how can I understand myself better so that I know why I was attracted to this person in the first place and what I did to contribute to the relationship not working? Those kinds of questions are an inherently important part of therapy for any breakup that's really hard. And they're actually part of how we are going to ensure that we don't end up in such a rough breakup in our next relationship or in such a dysfunctional relationship in our next relationship. Because the more we understand ourselves and what we're bringing to our romantic partnerships, the healthier choices we can make to ensure that we're getting the life that we really want to live.
Yeah, that introspection, unfortunately, is a lot of work, right?
Oh,
It's
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 so much work.
time consuming, it's painful, absolutely. But it's important to note, to take that time to examine yourself and how your past influences your present. There's a lot of overlap between what we're talking about and an earlier episode of the podcast, looking at revenge and
Mhm.
as revenge as an addiction. You should check,
Mm.
for listeners, check out the episode with James Kimmel. But he also equates the feelings of revenge with the addictive properties that you talk about. Um, I want to circle back because you mentioned relationship experience and how that early relationships, when you don't have a lot of experience, then you might be more affected by breakups. Um, as I was reading the book, I was thinking a lot about identity
Mhm.
and specifically how the complexity of how you view yourself seems to me to be a somewhat of an inoculation against these hard breakups, in the sense that if you are an individual that excels in various sports and you have interests and you have a large group, maybe not a large group, let's say you have a an adequate group of friends, so you have your social needs are met, your needs to feel effective in controlling your life, if these needs are met and you end a romantic relationship, your system, the self, as someone might
Mhm.
say, can accept that hit, that damage,
Mhm.
because there's all kinds of other things that make up who you are. You're
Mhm.
competent in these activities, you have a big social network. And that if you are the type of individual that, I guess, to say, put all your eggs into one relationship basket, and maybe even your identity is largely defined by the other person, that it gets much more difficult to accept, to engage in that radical acceptance.
Absolutely. And a lot of the factors you're talking about, I would call resiliency factors in general. They're associated with having a higher self-esteem, which we know is protective against all kinds of mental health symptoms in general. So when you have a core sense of who you are and what you are passionate about, and you have a good social support network, and you feel a sense of belonging to a community, that will help you get through adversity in general. It will help you overcome hardships, whether they come because of school or work or breakups or a loss in your life, right? So definitely. And I think one of the reasons that breakups are so hard for first loves is often because in young adulthood, the identity is still very much forming. And there is a tendency, including when people get married. So we're talking not as much about divorce here, but divorce certainly is associated with some really rough breakups, where it really is a part of the process to develop an identity that is part of a couple, where you go from, I have an individual identity, which for anyone listening, I hope you never lose because you're still you, even if you're part of a couple. But there's often a shift to a we because we, when we get into a couple, also have a shared lifestyle and a shared belief system and a shared value set that leads us to get married or to choose to spend our life together or to have children together or to build a future. And in many ways, that's really important for bonding and for becoming attached to a mate. In many ways, that can be healthy. But during a breakup, the couple identity shatters. And so a lot of people are left with a massive identity shift that asks, well, who am I now? What am I now? Who am I without this person that I built my life with, that I shared all of these experiences with, that I even maybe created a faulty reality in my own mind with about who they are or what it meant for me. Maybe it gave me a sense of security. Maybe it gave me a sense of meaning that now, as a single person, I don't even know I believe in anymore. I don't know what my life is going to look like.
Mhm.
That identity shift can be so hard. And oftentimes when people are in committed relationships, they let slide some of those individual identity important resiliency factors because they're devoting so much energy to their mate, especially if they fall madly in love with them. And so part of recovery for many people is rediscovering who they are now, how that's congruent with perhaps who they were before they started dating their ex, how it might be different or how they'd like it to be different, and really exploring what they want for themselves moving forward as a single person who is no longer in this relationship with their ex.
Is the weight of a relationship in terms of how someone views themselves, in terms of the pie chart of an individual,
Mhm.
for individuals where the pie chart is largely consumed by their relationship with their romantic partner, do you, is the size of that chunk of the pie, is that why people tend to crave and want to rekindle relationships post breakup that were obviously problematic, right? Because this happens all the time where people break up and one party is kind of caught in this cycle. You call it the exaholic cycle,
Mhm.
and peers that can be objective are obvious. They're concluding like, why are you going back to this person? This was not a good relationship. And it brings up this question: why is it that people go to uh, pursue these relationships that were obviously problematic from the start?
Well, I think it goes back to the nature of addiction. I think, I can't even tell you how many people struggling with really rough breakups will say to me, rationally, I know this isn't healthy. Rationally, I don't even like my ex. Rationally, I remember how bad it was. This was not a good relationship for me to be in anymore. And yet, I keep going back. I can't stop thinking about them. I want answers. I search for them online. I look at my phone every day to see if they posted something on social media. Every day I want to call them. Every day I'm thinking about the person they're now dating and how much I hate them. Why? Why does my rational mind not match with my internal emotional experience? And I think it really comes down to the addictive nature of love, that love is actually not rational. You can tell me the thousand things you want in a mate. You can tell me the thousand things you love about your current partner or your child. And the reality is that is not going to encapsulate why you love them because it isn't rational. It's emotional and it's biological. And you're driven to go back to them because at one point you felt so strongly about them. Because at one point they mattered so much that your life revolved around them. They brought you emotional euphoria or well being in some way that felt magical. And now you have to unlearn that. And
Mhm.
the only way to unlearn that really is to stop using the addictive stimulus, which means the first step on your breakup journey is to try to cut off contact with your ex as much as possible. That includes ideally not communicating with them at all, not following them on social media, not asking your friends about who they are or what they're doing, putting all of the gifts and pictures and toothbrushes and clothes in a box and sending it back to them or sticking it in the garage. Truly, it means you need to detach from your ex enough that you can start to look in the mirror at yourself instead of being so hyper focused on them so that you can stop this cycle of symptoms, which is a lot of what you described, where when people who are going through an exaholic breakup make contact with their ex, when they feel close to them, either by actually being in touch with them, talking to them, texting them, having sex with them, or by being reminded of them, like searching for them on social media or putting on their t-shirt or sleeping on their side of the bed. They are essentially using the addictive stimulus. They are essentially keeping the relationship alive that is no longer, that is gone. It makes them feel better in the short term. But in the long term, the problem is that it fuels all those other miserable symptoms that they have. It fuels the obsessive rumination and thinking. It fuels the cravings. It fuels behaviors that are not going to serve them well in the long run, like checking their phone, trying to run into their ex, or distracting themselves from their pain, like drinking too much or going on dating apps and trying to create dates so that they can post online and make their ex jealous. It keeps the relationship alive in a way that is not serving their mental health interest.
Yeah, it goes back to some research, the white bear studies, which look at thought suppression, which is, you know, try to not think of a white bear. Not thinking about something is an active process. So if you try to not think about something, it counterintuitively keeps it at the front of your mind. So that's, to support that section of your book where you talk about the importance of no contact.
Mhm.
Um, let's let's stay on this. Let's stay in this area of the key strategies for dealing with love addiction. So you just mentioned no contact. Obviously, that's very challenging. Again, you have your feet. It's that rational brain versus your emotional brain. Your emotional brain wants to be close, but we know that we need to cut off in order to start our healing process. But
Mhm.
you mentioned, all these other behaviors that people might engage in to distract themselves.
Mhm.
Um, this is an interesting problem, which is what do you do with all of these negative feelings? Because on one hand, there might be a place for just pure distraction. Well, you need to distract yourself from thinking about your ex, but at the same time, is that prohibiting you from processing what happened? Like, do you need to sit and look and soak in these negative emotions? Well, how would you describe this process of actually, like, what do you do with all of these negative emotions that you're feeling?
I think the short answer is that you need both. And the reason that I say that is that you don't want to distract all the time because you're not going to do the in-depth work that's required to actually understand yourself and heal. But you probably can't afford to sit in your emotion 24/7 because it's just going to look like you're incredibly depressed and anxious. And I should say that people who are going through exaholic breakups oftentimes show up to therapy with some pretty significant symptoms of depression and anxiety, crying a lot, feeling very sad, um, panicked, anxiety around when can I see them and how can I make this go away, right? So you really want a balance of both. You are going to have to sit with the feelings and you're going to have to explore them. And there are so many CBT based skills that are really effective that people can learn to use with themselves to get better at it, right? And I think that's the good news. That's the good news for all of us. There are ways to help ourselves through adverse experiences, including breakups. So, one, I highly recommend journaling for anyone out there. It is a wonderful method of self expression. It's a wonderful way to build insight and awareness into your own experiences and to explore it in a non judgmental way that no one will ever see. I recommend that people set aside rumination time where literally they put in their schedule that they are going to spend 20 minutes after they wake up just thinking about their ex and the breakup. All the things they want to tell them, They can scream, they can cry, they can ask questions, whatever it is, spend the time ruminating everything, the good, the bad, and the ugly. And then when the time is up, it is time to learn some skills so that you are not thinking about your ex. Because the reality is, you still have to live your life. And you don't want thoughts of your ex to dominate your daily experience. So, this is where you can practice mindfulness, for example, where you just learn to notice the thoughts. You see them, you're aware of them, you don't attach to them, you don't indulge in them, you just sort of are an observer of your thinking through the day. Or thought stopping, where anytime a thought of your ex comes up, you literally picture a stop sign and you say, not right now, not until my next rumination time. You might do some self-care activities, going to a 12-step group for relationships. There are many of them, or calling a friend or going to a yoga class. Those are in some ways distracting, but they're also aimed at empowerment, at helping yourself feel better, at taking care of your physical and emotional health, at building social support. So, really finding a way to both process and cope by not indulging in the 24/7 symptoms is part of the journey for most people.
Yeah, yeah, and obviously, it's you, people have to be prepared for, the long haul, right? Because this is just, as we've discussed, when these relationships, dig into us, they leave a hole when they leave, and so it's not just like real physical wounds, right? It's not intended to heal overnight. And it reminds me of, physical rehab, right? Physical rehab, you obviously you have to work the muscle, you have to work the limb that was injured, but if it starts to hurt too much, right, you have to maybe pull back a little bit. And
Mhm.
it kind of, it seems to me that that's very similar to what you're recommending for getting over these feelings. Um, as as we wrap up, I have to ask about, for those that are trying, so they've made some progress with their breakup. They're starting to get back to normal. People are going to ask themselves the question, am I ready to date again?
Mhm.
I find this question very interesting because, I think the textbook answer is, well, you need to spend some time grieving this past relationship and maybe, develop some takeaways. Like, how did you contribute to this relationship? Were there some patterns in your attraction or patterns in the way that you attached to your partner,
Mhm.
that contributed to its end? So obviously you want to go through all this before you start to date again. However, I've read some articles suggesting that, maybe people should get into a relationship when they're uncomfortable and they're still exploring this process, because it takes other brains to interact with our own in order to really grow. Right? There's like a ceiling of how much we can introspect and learn about ourselves,
Mhm.
but we at some point we need interaction. So what are your thoughts on this topic? How do you see when someone is ready to date again?
Let me start by saying I really agree with you that we really learn the most through dynamic interaction with other people. We learn the most about ourselves because we can be in a Zen moment on a mountaintop all by ourselves and do some meditation and have some self exploration. But the only way you're going to really learn about your triggers, about what you really think and feel, is by responding to the outside world, actually. And so, relationships to me are one of our best learning opportunities. And that includes relationships that are great and relationships that have been really hard. When people consider dating again, The biggest question I am asking is, what is your motivation? Oftentimes, early in a breakup, the motivation to date again is either to distract themselves from the pain of the breakup or it's to somehow make their ex angry and jealous. Those are still reasons that are focused on the ex and focused on a person's feelings about their ex. And to me, are not good reasons to date yet. When the person says, I don't know if I'm ready to date, I am trying to create a different experience for myself. I have no idea really how it's going to go, but I know that I want to move forward. I generally will say, think of it as a big experiment. I don't inherently think there's anything wrong with people trying to date again, as long as the motivation is for their own benefit and learning. And usually, if someone tries to date too soon after a breakup, it becomes apparent to them pretty quickly, either because the people they're dating will say, you are not available, which is a big turnoff, or because they will start to have feelings for someone else or be sexual with someone else and say, oh my gosh, I am clearly not ready for this. And so think of it as an experience of learning about yourself. But keep in mind that if your goal is to do this because you're reacting to the breakup itself or to your ex, I would pause.
Well, again, the name of the book is Letting Go of Your Ex, CBT Skills to Heal the Pain of a Breakup and Overcome Love Addiction. I really loved all of the anecdotes that you included. There are lots of easy to relate to anecdotes that show the different flavors of breakups and the thought patterns that people engage in. So I highly recommend picking that up. Thank you again for joining me today, Cortney Warren.
My pleasure, and best of luck to anyone listening. Breakups can be really tough.
For more on Cortney, visit drcortney.com. That's drcortney.com. Or pick up a copy of Letting Go of Your Ex, CBT Skills to Heal the Pain of a Breakup and Overcome Love Addiction, wherever books are sold. If you enjoy this podcast, please share an episode with two of your friends. Head over to patreon.com/whydowethatpodcast to become a paid supporter of the show. You'll gain early access to episodes as well as bonus video content. Follow on Instagram or Facebook at Why Do We Do That Podcast, or on X at WDWDT Until next time, this is Dr. Ryan Moyer, hoping you found some answers to the question, why do we do that?